Today we're going over a young physicist's cover on whether or not Einstein believes in God, but he gets way more opinionated than just talking about what Einstein believed. And I think, like many other professionals that are even more famous in their respective fields, whenever they don't study primarily religion or philosophy, they still like to comment on it, and they make a lot of claims that just don't even add up logically. And as Christians, I think it's interesting to explore those thoughts that just don't check out and aren't reflecting Christ accurately, or even just thinking about theism properly. Let's break it down. Forgive me if I don't pronounce the author's name right, but Apron Day, he actually starts off the article in a way that I agree to an extent. In his first paragraph, he talks about how Einstein did believe in God, but this doesn't mean what you think it means, he says. In short, he says if you're a theist, don't even think of using the example of Einstein's belief in God to defend and justify your views. In parentheses, no offense. I get what he's saying here, but I don't think there is zero merit to using Einstein to talk about what we believe in. We can make the point that genius people are convinced that there's a God behind things. I can't make the full Christian case or any other specific case for any other religion. We'll go on, and I can't agree at all in the next paragraph that he articulates here. And I'll just quote it and we'll talk about it. He says, "There is nothing wrong in believing in a particular religion as long as you don't justify incorrect actions on the basis of that." There's an issue with this because this person, assuming they're speaking as a naturalist or someone that doesn't subscribe to a particular religion, they have no basis for morality. So I would ask them, define incorrect actions that someone might justify. How do we know what's incorrect? How do we know what's wrong? How do we know what's right? If it only boils down to law, like your government's law as the highest form of right and wrong, then there's an issue. Because, for example, look at Nazi Germany. There's a reason when the Nazi generals were prosecuted in their Nuremberg trials that we had to appeal to a law above the law, as it was said. Because they were pointing out, well, our government told us to do the things that we were doing and the Jews that we were executing. We were told to do that. So there's nothing wrong with it. But they were told, no, there's a law above the law and you know this is wrong. So in other words, we have to appeal to God in order to have correct and incorrect actions that, we can either argue to justify or argue are wrong. Yet this person is coming with no frame of morality, no frame in a religion, and saying, all these religious people, they're using religion to justify incorrect actions. But then I'm like, whoa, you seem to have a religion of your own because you're deeming things are incorrect and correct, that can be justified or not justified. So you would need to have that conversation with that person. How do you know what is right and wrong then? But obviously I subscribe to Christianity, and so I'm going to judge actions I see on the basis of Christ. What is the basis of his morality and what's wrong and right? And why is science ever going to give you a wrong and right? Science will tell you how someone poisoned your grandma, not if they should have done it, So he has no basis, yet he's accusing us of having a faulty basis. At least we have a basis if we're theists that subscribe to something specific. We'll go further. He says physics, or in general science, is better and more fundamental than religion. And he goes on to argue that that is the case because people will agree on physics and things to do with science more than they will agree on the tenets of religion. So that's his claims and the argument he uses. And I'll respond first to the claim that science is better than religion. I think this is just a silly statement because it's a category difference. So it'd be like if I said that hamburgers are better than push-ups. You would obviously be confused if someone said that because one is a food that you would expect to be compared to other foods and one is an exercise. And so, they're just different categories. So how the world works versus its creator are two separate categories, right? And so whenever he's saying science is better, that's illogical to me because I'm just thinking science is figuring out how the world works. Religion is figuring out who made the world or what made the world, you might say. So they're just two separate categories. It's not that one is better. It's just that they're on different planes, and we have to respect that. It's not that they're fighting each other. They're just different questions. And science is a process. So what do you mean it's better? Like it's going to result in a better society? Uh, I would question if you are familiar with your history of the 20th century and saw what happened whenever science was the foundation in places like Nazi Germany, and experiments were taking place under the assumption that you can just have experiments and there is no value to human life, or the sort of things that took place in Stalin's Russia. So, maybe look into those things. But if y'all want, I can leave in the description a video on just the case for the fact that, the Western society founded upon Christian morals is just kind of how we define better, and actually has been broadly agreed upon with the values it brings, and things like how we're made in the image of God, so we're valuable, that you shouldn't hurt the innocent, and things like that. That's actually founded upon Christian values, and there's a really good book on that by an author and a historian named Tom Holland, not the actor, that I would recommend you check out. But yeah, so maybe if he's appealing to the fact that he thinks science alone would make a better society, again, science can tell you how your grandma was poisoned, not if you should or shouldn't have. And that point and that truth can result in much that you would obviously deem as wrong if someone only went on the framework of science when they decide to make their actions. Anyway, his other half of his claim is that science is more fundamental than religion. And I think that's silly, because if there's a God who made the laws that we're talking about, he's obviously more fundamental than the laws you're discovering, because he made them. So he's assuming that naturalism is true and there's no God whenever he says that science is more fundamental. To me, the fact that laws exist at all point to a God, and if God exists, he made those laws and is more fundamental. That's the point I would make on that note. But more addressing the reasoning he gave again, which is that, well, this is true because physics all around the world is the same. Again, it's just a category issue. I don't think that we are going to tend to agree about specific cases of what should and shouldn't be done morally, and the tenets of God as easily as we can agree that when I drop this object, it goes down. I also don't think that we are going to be as open to brute facts like something falling and then discovering how that works, as much as we are going to be open to arguments that we criticize ourselves on how we have behaved. You would have to assume that we have a humility that's just as open as our curiosity of how things work. And sadly, I don't think that's true, but maybe you're more optimistic about humans than me, and that's why you're confused why we haven't all just figured out all the moral qualms that are out there. I actually do think that there's a God that is ready to reveal himself if you were actually to seek him, but I think the author himself here is a prime example where someone is harsh towards the idea of a God that would impose rules on him and would not be quick to agree that they are the best thing for him. So it's kind of a prime example. He makes some statements that I actually agree with, but I don't think they help his case. For example, he says people bend religion to their wills. So yeah, for example, whenever Muhammad says that it's okay to sleep with women and plunder the people that you've just taken over, here's the source for that on screen real quick. That benefits him, and that brings him things that he wants and followers. And that's just one example. But yeah, I agree, people bend religion to their wills. But there's no benefit if I incorrectly understand gravity and then try and apply that in some craft that I'm making, because it's only going to result in consequences. So, in other words, bending religion to your will can benefit you. Misunderstanding how the world works cannot benefit you. And so, of course, people have converged more on science because it always benefits them. But converging on the truth with regard to religion does not always benefit us in the ways that we want. So, converging on the truth of science ultimately will always be able to give us things that we want. Converging on the truths of religion will not always be able to give you what you want. So, people have not converged on religion as much as they have science. I would point that out there. I think it's ridiculous how many times he appeals to morality in this article, yet doesn't have any actual framework he subscribes to, because he says sentiments that I appreciate, like how anyone is free to follow any religion. And there is nothing wrong with that. But even that's a silly statement, because how do you know what's wrong? And also, if someone used religion to justify devaluing a human, wouldn't you say that's wrong on the fundamental impression of morality? So there are times when it's wrong to follow religion. But then how does he even know there's wrong at all? I can have this discussion as a theist and say that I actually do think there's times where it's wrong to follow certain religions. The problem is when religion clashes with science. I would say that God is going to line up and make sense with the laws he created. But any clashing of science, God, if God is actually out there, anytime we think they're clashing, it's actually just us misunderstanding if he really is out there. So, yeah, I agree that there's an issue whenever people, for example, say that the world is flat and justify it by religion. I'm a Christian, but I'm not convinced that the world is flat biblically. There were times where people came to that conclusion in ways I can argue against quite simply when we talk about the literary examples that brought them to those conclusions. So I do agree that there's a problem when religion clashes with science, but that's not all he's saying in this article. He's saying religion is better and that it's more fundamental, and that's where we're going to have our issues. He goes on to say that there's two types of gods. There's the interfering God that interacts with us, and there's the uninterested God that doesn't interfere at all. And he says if you believe in the first type of God that interacts, there's no point to fundamental science. I think that's ridiculous because just in believing there's an interacting God, that doesn't mean I shouldn't figure out how his world works. He makes his case by starting and saying that everything can be changed by an interacting God. And that's true, everything can be changed, but that doesn't mean I believe in a God that's constantly changing laws. If I believed that he was constantly changing laws, that specific interacting God, then yeah, there'd be no point in science because the laws would constantly be changing. But that's not necessarily what you believe about an interacting God. So it's just not a good argument. And he says if it's true that there's an interacting God, that instead of researching, our times would be better employed worshiping this God. That assumes that you can't worship God by discovering the world he's given us. And obviously you can worship God by discovering and exploring the glorious world he's given us. I think you can make him happy in that way. Biblically, I can definitely give you scripture to prove that. One of his first assignments to Adam was literally to name animals and species. If that's not scientific, I don't know what is. And we glory all the time in just pondering his universe. Romans 1 is really big on that. And I'll tell you what, I think there are some other reasons why this guy hopes the first type of God doesn't exist. If the first type of God exists, then he is accountable to that God who has made rules, who cares about what he has done, and will probably judge him based on those rules he gives, unless it's just arbitrary, which wouldn't make sense. We're talking about the God that cares then. So I think there's some other reasons why this guy might not want the first God to exist. But instead, he throws it out as, we don't want him to exist because then, we wouldn't have any reason to discover how his world works, which is just not a reason. That's just not necessarily true. He goes on to say that we don't even have to say the second type of God exists, and it's just obviously hatred for the idea of God at all, as he just keeps going further. Y'all can read the rest of this article. I did not get to go through all of it. I really just covered the first portion of it, and there's just a lot more that I didn't have time to go through. But he says, I myself wish to pursue physics and not philosophy or metaphysics as I grow up. I believe him here after reading this. He's pursued physics, but not philosophy. And philosophy is actually something we need to deal with alongside physics. Just because you're an expert in the field of scientific claims does not mean then you're going to have a genius when you write an article that makes a bunch of philosophical claims. So I definitely believe this guy when he says that he didn't want to study philosophy. It's kind of evident. No offense to him, as he says, no offense to us. Yeah, no hatred towards this author. I actually was hoping to have a conversation further on some of the claims he made. I just kind of present him with the logic that I did in this video, so we'll see if I get that opportunity. I do believe I reached out to him if I have the right contact. But yeah, one more point I'd make when we talk about an interacting God, because he makes his point at the end of the article here. I don't need an interacting God for his conscience and to be happy in the way he's going on and living. He just doesn't need one. Einstein did for his reasons, but the author here is saying, I don't need one. I think he hasn't thought it through long enough, and if he did, he would realize that he also relies on the idea of a God if he was thinking things through. Why is that? That is because, in the same way C.S. Lewis makes this point in his book Miracles, whenever we make claims about the world and our trust in our cognitive abilities to figure out how the world works, we are crediting ourselves. We are saying that I was able to figure this thing out. It wasn't random, it wasn't by chance, there was rationale to this to reach the truth. If naturalism is true and there is no God, then any conclusion that I come to and articulate and my mouth makes noises to produce, it's just chance. Like Dawkins says, we are dancing to our DNA if naturalism is true. So, naturalism being true, any conclusions I come to or someone else, it's not to their credit or merit, nor is it anything against them. It's just how their chemicals bounced. Why even argue with me? You're just going to deal with the chance of chemicals bouncing to produce what we say. Now, that's silly to me because I think our experience testifies that we do have a conscience that goes beyond just the chance of our chemicals bouncing. I think that you should actually listen to your conscience when it tells you that and just rebels against the idea that everything is random because you go against our instincts all the time. When you want things, you can't say no. And why is that? I think it's because we're made in the image of God and we can actually trust our intellect, and it's not just random. It's not just a deception as it would be if naturalism is true. There are much better cases that have been made for everything I have said in this video, and I will also try and link in the description a video on why we can't trust our rationale and our cognitive faculties unless God is out there. The last thought I'll leave you guys with, if you aren't Christian, is that you really should look into this and you shouldn't dread looking into it, because if it's true, then we have a hope and we have fellowship with the creator that made this world. If you want to be curious about how it was made, how much more excited can you be about the one who made those laws you're looking into? And if it's true, and these moral qualms we just discuss are actually real, then initially you should be worried, because I'm not going to live up to the one that made these rules. There's no way. My conscience testifies that to me all the time. But if the innocent representative as Christ, Jesus, went in the first century and actually died and actually rose, which you can look into as a historical claim, if that actually happened, then the innocent representative went in our place and took the payment that we owe. And we can actually have fellowship with that creator. And so that's exciting to me. Please look into it. Love you guys. Thank you for watching. And subscribe if you want to see more content like this.